Film, are you going to kick us off with the logistics first, just after a few more people get admitted? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sounds good. You're welcome. All right. Well, as we wait, there's a few more people that are trickling in. Just trying to admit folks as we're going. All right, I would like to do just some very brief housekeeping before we get started. Welcome, everybody. It is a great day to be here on our webinar today with Melissa Manuel, and we have Sarah Kessler here that is going to introduce Melissa. Just some very brief housekeeping. Please do keep yourself on mute during the presentation. Please do collaborate with each other and with the participants by using the chat feature. We will have some time after the presentation for collaboration and question and answers, etc. Please, if you do would like to start your closed captions, do so by going to the bottom panel of Zoom and initiate closed captions. And without any further ado, I would like to hand it over to Sarah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Sarah Kessler, Chair of the Women's Caucus and Associate Registrar at the University of Georgia, and I'll be the moderator for this afternoon.
Yep.
We're glad to have Melissa with us today. Her webinar is Warmth-Competence Line. Melissa has focused on research in organizational behavior. She's worked in higher education for 16 years and has translated her own research interests into tangible outcomes for organizations and her colleagues. She's continuously focused on learning the best way to build collaborative and transparent teams while advocating for equal opportunities. Looks like I got muted along with some other people. So I'm not sure where I was and what everybody heard. So I'm just going to start with the recap of Melissa and her introduction, that she's been focusing on research and organizational behavior, working in higher ed for 16 years, and then translated that research interest into tangible outcomes for organizations and her colleagues. She's continuously focused on learning the best way to build collaborative and transparent teams while advocating for equal opportunities and advancement for professional women. Melissa earned her MBA in 2016 and is currently enrolled in a PhD program studying organizational culture and expatriates in the Middle East while serving as a university registrar for a new university in Saudi Arabia. And Melissa is also board member currently for the Women's Caucus. Following the webinar, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. And as Belma stated earlier, please post your questions or be prepared to ask after the presentation. And now I'd like to hand it over to our speaker.
Thank you.
All right, let's just share. Oops, open this up over here. All right, does that look okay?
Perfect.
Lovely. Okay, great. I'm just going to open up the chat again, just in case anything pops up there. Okay, so Warmth-Competence Line. So welcome to today's webinar on the Warmth-Competence Line. This is absolutely an area of interest of mine as it really hones into the workplace practices and very relevant data that do affect women in the workplace. As Sarah mentioned, I am a member of the Women's Caucus, and as a member and an advocate for supporting professional women's development, as well as women in STEM, in which I gave the seminar last year at a STEM conference. I am really hoping to continue this research to really promote some of the data and what we can do to actually support organizational behavioral change. So with that, I actually do want to invite, if anybody is interested in continuing this research with me, to contact me. I do have my email at the end of the slides. So I'd be happy to do that. And again, I'm hoping to start doing some publishing on that. And I'm also very happy to announce that I will be giving this same webinar or seminar at our ACRO annual conference in Ohio in April. And so here in this webinar, I have included response practice in the workplace. We will be talking a little bit about how to manage actual response practice. But during the ACRO annual conference, we'll spend a little less time on the theoretical side and a little bit more time on actual practical application so that we do have a chance to really brainstorm various scenarios and how we work within that. I do know some of this research can be a little bit frustrating for women that do face many of these issues. And my goal is to empower through knowledge. So we will look at what the research tells us. And yes, it is a little discriminatory, but then we will also focus on how to manage it, and then even better, how we can change it. Okay, so Warmth-Competence Line. This is a stereotype content model that defines two essential dimensions of social perception. One is warmth and one is competence. So the perceived combinations of these engender very distinct emotional responses that affect group behavior and stereotypes. So what we can do is use this to understand how our behaviors affect the perceptions of those that we're working with, and then how we can actually learn to respond to those and expect what kind of responses we'll be getting from our colleagues. So this is just a little bit of a matrix to understand kind of how the warmth competency works. So you'll notice that warmth is on one line and competency is on the other axis. And you can be in various quadrants and in a various range of areas depending on where you sit on the warmth versus competency line. So when we say the word warmth, what does that mean to you? So if you want to take 30 seconds, pop various words or phrases into the chat of how you would perceive warmth in the workplace. So this may be different than how you perceive it personally, but just anything that comes to mind. Great. Friendliness, caring, kindness, empathy is a big one. This one is very particular to females, which I think is a very good strength of women in the workplace. Approachable, absolutely. Accessible. Collaborative, group-oriented, yes. Great listener, we're very good at that. Helper, yes. Helper is a really interesting one. In some other research that I've done, women are very often defined as helpers, but that can actually be detrimental on the competency line. And if you have any questions about that, we can chat a little bit about that afterward. Ally, good listener, great. So very similar things that came up in the research. Friendliness, trustworthiness, empathy, and kindness. Not forceful, that's a really good one too. So really good words that support what warmth is. So same thing with competency. How would you describe competency in the workplace? And this is interesting. Some people do struggle with what this means in a very tangible concept, but just feel free again to pop out any words or phrases that you think define competency. Ability, good, capable. Leadership, I love that. Able. Knowledgeable, that's a good one. Yes. Dependable, accurate, detailed, can do, confidence, I like that. Tested record of accomplishment. Absolutely. This is that one I really, really like. Confidence in control. Very interesting. I like that. Good. So, yep, very similar. Intelligence, power, efficacy, and skill. And these keywords, again, did come from the research. And this is not my own research. I will be going through the references afterward. But yeah, these are keywords that came from that. So this one actually is Cuddy and another one. Okay, so warmth or its absence indicates whether others are likely to have a positive or negative intention toward us. Again, not surprising if we're cold in the workplace, people are going to maybe feel a little bit of a negative effect toward us. And I've included this photo because smiling, actually, in another piece of research as well, really demonstrates warmth, especially for females. So making sure your use of smile, but then also there's another little attachment to that is making sure you're authentic. And again, lots of research has been done on authentic warmth in the workplace. We won't be going too much into detail on that, but again, happy to chat about that more at the end of today's session. And then competence has been described, or at least in this research, as the ability to bring about desired outcomes. So that's why I liked Lynn's competency to tested record of accomplishment. You're actually getting something done. So warmth and competency govern social judgments of people, especially women in the workplace. And again, of course, we're going to touch on that. And humans do make snap judgments on this line all the time. Is it always right? No, but it is an ingrained evolutionary trait. And this is really important. I know this for many people, this does feel really unfair, and absolutely it is. But at the same time, we do know that this is a human trait and that we do make these snap judgments, and making sure that we understand that this is not that someone's trying to be mean in the workplace by any means, but that it is just not a natural reaction depending on what happens. But if we know how we're perceived through some of these interactions, then we can manage that a little bit better. So most of the research that I'm presenting today was taken from a particular study published in 2011. And last year, Harvard Business Review published a very similar study on the warmth competency line, but then applied it to women. And then I've added some additional research as well. So I'm going to start with a warmth competence matrix. I'm going to preface by saying I actually don't like this matrix at all. I don't like some of the wording that's used, but, and this is a non-scientific professional version, but this was taken from LinkedIn. And what I found was presenting this matrix first helped to understand a little bit more about some of the more intricacies of some of the research that was done later on. So again, this does not have a lot of scientific rigor to it, but really helps to kind of understand the conceptual foundation of what we're going to talk about right after. So on one side, you have the warmth side, which is high versus low warmth. The other axis, you have competency, which is again low and high, and then you have this matrices in the middle. So I don't like this word hated, but again, it really does help understand what we're talking about. So if you have a low warmth and a low competency in the workplace, and potentially even personally, you are eliciting a behavioral response that people are openly hostile against you or toward you, because you're not necessarily a nice person and you're not necessarily doing anything to help them. So again, I don't know if I like so much the word hated, but it does help with that. So with a high warmth and low competency, you're well liked because you're a nice person. You do have a high warmth level, but you're not necessarily competent, which means there's a little bit of a pity there. And this elicits a behavioral response that no one necessarily wants to work with you, but they will help you because you are a nice person. So in the high competency range, but low warmth, we have envy. And this behavioral response, people want you to fail and won't help you to succeed. And again, that's because you might be a little bit arrogant because you are very good at your job, but you're at the same time potentially very cold. And then we have the final box, which is well liked and admired, and this is where you'd want to be. So this was taken off of LinkedIn. Again, I do have the link to it. It was a very interesting report that was done, and it kind of just helps to understand a little bit more about the practical application. So the next one I want to go through is the bias map, and this one does have a lot more scientific rigor to it. It's just a little bit more complex. And I do really encourage you to read the entirety of this article, as it does have very practical information with very key examples of words you can use to demonstrate warmth as well as competence. And so when I have the references, I will also put that in the chat so that you can take a look at that at your own leisure. So with this one, we have, again, the warmth on our y-axis and the competency on our x-axis with the low and high. So in this bottom corner, so the way it was described before was hatred. In this research by Cuddy et al., it was done as contempt. So again, you're not necessarily competent, but you're also not very warm. So you're not necessarily a good person to be working with. With the warmth side, so as we go up onto the warmth, we're still low competency, we have neglecting. So this is passive harm in that people want to neglect to work with you. It's very easy to kind of dismiss you. And then, once we have high warmth, we have that pity sphere, which means you are a nice person, but you're not necessarily good at your job. And this can be a very challenging place to be, especially if you're looking for promotional opportunities. So in the competency side, as we start to increase our competency, but we still have a low warmth, we have active harm. So this is where you're eliciting a harassment response. And some of the words that were used in the research was very attacking, in that you're trying to be better at your job, but you're not necessarily considered or perceived as being a nice person. And this could be for a variety of reasons. So in that high competency area, we do have envy, but again, that's with low warmth. And then as we start to increase on the competency and high warmth, we have active facilitation. So this is that helping sphere where you're eliciting a helping response. People do want to be nicer to you because you are a nice person, but your competency still needs a little bit of work. And then as we move up the warmth side and we're still in high competency, we have passive facilitation. So convenient cooperation, a really good way is to define this is quid pro quo. So you're good at your job, you're still maybe not fully trustworthy. People don't necessarily want to interact as much with you because maybe there's a little bit of a coldness there, but it is a convenient cooperation. So quid pro quo is a good way to define that. And then at the top, we have admiration. This is, of course, where we want to be. We want to be highly competent and very warm. So with this, So with this, moving on into what this potentially means in a workplace sphere is because the warmth dimension is primary. So it's due to perceived link to others' intention. Perceived warmth predicts very active behaviors, as we discussed. So groups judged as warm elicit active facilitation, i.e. help, whereas those who are judged lacking in warmth elicit active harm. So i.e. that attacking phrase. Competency, again, we a little bit discussed this already, being secondary, assesses others' capability to carry out those interactions, predicting passive behaviors. And groups judged as competent elicit that passive facilitation, convenient cooperation, where those that judged as lacking competence elicit passive harm, so neglect and ignoring. And again, distinct types of discrimination follow each warmth competency combination. So this is where it gets really interesting. So this is based on the research that I have done on top of this, as well as what was done by women looking at the warmth competency line. So we have our warmth competency sphere here, and then we're going to start with pity. So this one is really interesting because there was some really great research that came out in this particular article, but then also additional research that's been done that was strongly associated with working mothers. And I know this one was really difficult for a lot of people to hear when I presented this last time, and we did have a lot of discussions on it. But working mothers naturally hold higher perceptions of warmth, but then have a hard time demonstrating competency. And this was based on research that had been done or presented in 2018. So what the recommendation is if you are a working mother, is to really focus on your competency. So that boost so focusing on your competency by making sure you're actively telling people what you are completing and what you're doing. And you actually don't necessarily need to focus so much on the warmth side. So research has shown that the boost in working mothers' perceived warmth does not necessarily help them professionally, but they do have a perceived boost of warmth. So just by telling people that you're a mother or that you're an expecting mother, people will naturally perceive you as more warm just based on that alone, not anything that you've actually said or done besides that. But there is also then the apparent loss of perceived competency when you do say that you're a working mother. The other thing that came up in the literature was the gender diversity coverage. So if there are companies or organizations that are looking to have diverse gender positions and really starting to promote women in the workplace, that can actually have a detrimental effect on you being a woman in a senior type of leadership position, because then that comes in is that maybe you're not actually competent, you're just a nice person, and that's why they're promoting you. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that's true in any way, shape, or form. It's just some of the natural perceptions that happen in the workplace. So an evidence, okay, I'll follow that later. Okay, so then this was really interesting here is we have this admiration section, and this is of course where everybody wants to fall. And research shows that based on your interactions in the workplace, men have this much space to fall into that admiration area. But what happens is women's is actually smaller than that. So one negative interaction can actually kick women outside of that admiration sphere into passive facilitation or active facilitation, or potentially even out to the bottom half as well. And I'm going to come back to envy in a second, but this was really interesting in that one cold situation can actually negate your entire warmth factor. You could have a really great relationship with your team and with the people that you work with, but let's say you have to make one cold decision that might even be completely warranted and agreed upon by those that you work with, that can actually kick you out of that admiration area into being considered as very low warmth. And this is something to be very, I think, knowing about, so that if you are making these very difficult positions, let's say you're going to a new organization that's going through a lot of budget cuts, is to be aware of that so that you can manage that appropriately. So then coming to the envy section, which I've circled here on the bottom right-hand side, is that women, female leaders consistently do fall into a competent but cold cluster. So envy is very high competency but low warmth, because women are perceived as less competent than men, and then they violate the prescriptive stereotype of how they should behave. And therefore they experience negative reactions that are called stereotypical backlash. So this again is something to be very aware of, is that you are a very high competent female, and in the workplace is that you do need to be aware of where your warmth range is and potentially lift that up in order to take you out of that envy and bring you up into that admiration area. Again, these can be very difficult things to do because very few circumstances actually again can move you out of that range. So we do have a harder time as females getting to where we want to be. But again, as we learn about how to manage these interactions, then we can take appropriate measures for that. So active harm, i.e. harassing, women are judged on micromanagement more so than men. Again, something to be aware of is potentially giving more space to your employees than you would potentially see other men doing in the workplace. And especially if you do have men on your team, because they would expect potentially more freedom under a female. Again, there can be a lot of discussion on those pieces. And competent women do risk being stereotyped as a non-traditional woman associated with reduced warmth. So again, what we talked about a little bit in that envy sphere. So something really to be aware of, and again, and how to manage that. So looking at how to manage that line, and a lot of this was actually again taken from various research articles that came out that looked at how women specifically can increase or decrease, I don't know if you'd want to decrease so much, but increase that warmth and competence side. So on the warmth side, we have asking. So instead of actively challenging, let's say you're in a meeting and somebody is saying something that's completely off the charts, and you, instead of challenging, is reframing what you're saying into more of a question. So what would be the downside of that? Or is there another possibility? And making it more or less, I guess just more warmth when you're working with your colleagues, especially with men. And then connecting is developing that personal relationship with your colleagues. This is something that I've been very lucky that I've worked for smaller institutions. And part of what I was really trying to do is to develop one-on-one relationships, especially with our faculty and senior leaders, just having a casual coffee if they were open to that, to develop that personal relationship, because that was also a way to build that connection to make me better at my job, but also to help get feedback back on what I needed to do to potentially be a better manager, especially as a young female. So on the competency side is looking at asserting. So if you're somebody that you can definitely be high competence, but maybe you have a hard time bringing that out into, let's say, a group environment, is really practicing being assertive. So speaking with confidence really does make a difference, and focusing on the facts. One of the things that I personally do, again, as a young female in the workplace, is if I have something or an opinion that I want to state, is I look for research that helps to support my own opinions and statements. So things that I'll say, this institution, which is one of our benchmarking institutions, does it this way, and this is why. And that kind of helps with that asserting the opinion. So that's not just you, it's actually something that's supporting what you're trying to say. And then by qualifying. So publicly acknowledging your expertise. You are hired into a certain position for your expertise or for your ability to do that. And you can remind your colleagues of that. So for example, I'm an expert in this field and I think this, or I study this area extensively and I think why. It's your right to do that, and reminding people of your expertise is going to benefit you. Again, the way that you do it, of course, can make a difference, but really practicing that qualifying, especially I think in group scenarios. So 2 other recommendations are waiting. So wait to hear others' opinions and draw out their opinions before bringing in your own judgments. And this can really help with both managing that warmth side as well as that competency side. And then conferring with your team members and colleagues outside of meetings through offline communication, and to clarify and understand others' points of view and potentially what you can do to manage certain situations a little bit better. And this is, I think, a really important part of building a really good organizational culture, is having that personal connection and understanding why people think that the way that they do. So we're coming into masculinity and its effect on women in the workplace. And this is going to come back to that envy sphere. So that high competency, low warmth perception. I'm not saying that this is the way that certain people are, but it's the perception that you are in that box, whether or not you deserve to be there. So what drives envy on that bias map? And when we talk about masculinity, one of the things that is personally recommended by me is to avoid terms like fragile or toxic masculinity, because by using these terms, we potentially inadvertently spark resentment or challenge with our male colleagues. And the goal is to work together and not to alienate. So when someone refers to toxic or fragile masculinity, I really do try and recommend privately to just use the term masculinity, and we can define that in our culture and society the way that we want to. And so masculinity should be a positive thing on its own. So that's just my own 2 cents on that part. But when there is a threat to masculine identity in the workplace, which has been shown to be often, men are more likely to engage in harmful workplace behaviors. And these include withholding help, mistreating coworkers, stealing property, and lying for personal gain. And this did come straight from the research. What was interesting is when there was a threat to females, the same was not true for women. So women actually tended to not have outward behaviors that included withholding help or mistreating workers, but it was more internally defined. So this is a difference between men and women in the workplace. And again, something to be very aware of. And competent women unfortunately are a threat to masculinity in the workplace. And the research and the literature is very clear on this. I know this can be hard to manage and to understand, because we're working in cultures and environments that are both male and female. But now that we know this, then we can start to manage it a little bit better. So then how we can develop an equitable and collaborative workplace culture. So when it comes to the masculinity aspect, acknowledge it. Studies do show that men feel this threat, but they do often act unconsciously. They don't realize that this is the way that they're feeling and this is the way that they're starting to behave unless it's actually brought to their attention, which can be difficult. But again, acknowledging the act rather than the person can make a very big difference. And acknowledging competent women as a collaborator rather than a threat also leads to stronger and more stable and more valued organizations. So embrace healthy masculinity by promoting positive leadership traits, collaboration and equality over power and dominant traits. So if you see a man in the workplace that is demonstrating those positive traits that you want to see, really, again, acknowledge those behaviors and try and promote that within your own teams. Support autonomy, so freedom on how, when, and where men and of course women work. So this kind of comes back to how women are perceived as micromanagers more so than men, even though they might be managing their teams, men and women, the exact same way. So again, something to be mindful of. And supporting autonomy is not necessarily a bad way of potentially leading your teams. Again, this is going to be a personal choice, but potentially something that you might want to consider. And then calling out aggressive and bullying behaviors. And I want to really say that this is everybody's job. I think it can be more difficult for women to do versus men. And again, there's maybe some ways that we can discuss after today's webinar or even during ACRO conference on how to actually call out those aggressive behaviors in a way that doesn't, again, alienate your male colleagues or other colleagues that you are working with. And it really brings it back to being a part of your team's journey, and that's everybody's responsibility. So particularly for women, I do want to come into mentorship versus sponsorship. So mentors do help develop a division, whereas sponsors help drive your vision and expect actually performance or outcomes. And this is a really important aspect of women in the workplace. Research has shown that executive level men do spend time with other executive level men. Golf is a big one that came up, and that helps promote the men that they work with because they're hearing those ideas or that individual's ideas a lot more. They have that more personal connection. And so women do need this too. So finding opportunities for sponsorship where people can invite you into those social opportunities, or if you have somebody that is sponsoring you in ways that if you're in a workplace environment that says this person is working on that, I think she might be a really good person to work on this project with you. So things like this is having people in your corner to help support you, but also give you feedback on ways that you can manage the way that you are being perceived in your office environments. And when and women in positions of seniority, take active roles in sponsoring the amazing women that you work with. Name drop them. I'd like to do this for both my male and female employees, but especially when there's an opportunity to really take advantage of what some of my females have done, I really want to promote that so that they do have an opportunity to be looked at for succession planning. And that doesn't always happen because, again, men are more likely to spend social time with other men that they're working with. And that brings me to mentorship versus sponsorship. So this was a webinar that the Women's Caucus offered, I believe, last September. I want to maybe say September 2023. It was called Unlocking the Key to Enhancing Women's Career Velocity. I actually don't think I have the link in my references, but it was a really great webinar. And it really helped provide a lot of information on the differences between mentorship and sponsorship and what you can do in the workplace to promote sponsorship for yourself. So these are the references that I have. I really think they're great. The first one and the second one are absolutely fantastic. So those were done in 2007, 2008. And then the 2020, which is the one, 2023, which is the bottom one. I'm not even going to try and say that last name because I don't think I'm going to get it correct. How women on boards navigate that warmth competence line. That's where it kind of came with that female aspect on top of what original research has been done. And it's a fantastic article to read. And that is all for today. So thank you. Again, if you are interested in collaborating or continuing some of this research, I think there's a lot that we can do to bring into supporting women's development in professional settings. I'd be absolutely happy to collaborate with anybody that is interested. And again, I'm more than more than happy to chat with anybody after the conference that we'll have in Ohio in April. So with that, I'm going to exit this, and hopefully we'll have lots of questions come up and a lot of discussions, but I will allow the recording to come off so that we can have a really open discussion and no one has to worry about anything that they might have to say.